It has been a big week for civil rights in North Carolina, both through activism on the ground and also leadership from the Obama administration. On the same day that those Moral Monday protests resumed, Eric Holder's Justice Department made another move against some of the harshest voter suppression laws in the nation. The DOJ, along with the North Carolina NAACP, filed a motion asking a federal court to urgently step in and block North Carolina's Voter Information Verification Act. That is the law that cracks down on some of the voting methods used mostly by black voters, such as early voting, same-day registration, and certain voting out of precinct options. The law also introduces a strict voter ID rule, though that doesn't go into effect until 2016. The DOJ brief is assertive in confronting the North Carolina law, arguing that it was crafted in order to discriminate and that it singles out voting mechanisms like early voting. In 2012, it says 70% of all African-American voters used early voting, compared to just 52% of white voters. The DOJ's brief also argues that North Carolina has been so unfair, federal observers should be deployed in the coming months to ensure that midterm elections there are legitimate. Lawyers for North Carolina asked that the challenge to the law be thrown out, but even the state's attorney general admits the changes to the election system aren't good.
New election law changes signed by the governor and this General Assembly are bad public policy for North Carolina. We should be encouraging people to register and to vote, and we should make it easier for them instead of making it harder.
Joining me now, Corey Dade, contributing editor to The Root, and Michael Higginbotham, professor of law at University of Baltimore. Welcome to you both. Professor, walk us through first what the Justice Department is trying to do here and how they can still do it under what's left of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, I think the Justice Department, as well as the ACLU and the NAACP in North Carolina, are absolutely justified in their concern that the democratic process is being harmed by this new law. Their argument is simply this, that this new law, which limits early voting, which eliminates same-day registration during the early period, and which also will implement a new restrictive voter ID law, that they will have a disproportionate impact on a number of constituencies, including younger voters, the elderly, the handicapped, but most significantly on black voters. Black voters participated in the last two presidential elections in 2008 and in 2012. They voted 70%. Of black voters voted in the early voting process in North Carolina. So this law will clearly have a negative impact on them, and that's the Justice Department's concern.
Corey, what do you make of this week's news?
I think the Justice Department is being consistent. They have been tracking North Carolina's efforts as they have in Texas and South Carolina and others, and so they're certainly bringing the hammer down to the extent that they can. I think what's interesting here is sort of we step back and kind of think about what brought this about. African Americans outperformed whites in the last two elections, presidential elections in North Carolina in 2008 and 2012. And as soon as the Republicans came in and took over the legislature and the governor's office, they came in and made a beeline and shut all that down. So it's one thing for these voting restrictions to be enacted without there being some evidence that a certain particular group is affected. But here we have overwhelming evidence that not only 70% of blacks would be affected, for example, by reducing early voting, but more than half of the entire electorate of the state. So there's irrefutable evidence that this is discriminatory.
Yeah, and Professor, when you look at this, the motion points out that when you reduce the early voting period, it, of course, disproportionately burdens African-American voters. It also just takes out about 1 out of 3 voters. When you look compared to 2012, the week of early voting that was eliminated, it was 900,000 ballots, or 35% of all votes. If you're watching this kind of thing, whether you're a voting rights expert or not, you look at that and you think, how can that be legal?
Well, this is what really concerns me, and I think other members of the civil rights community as well as the Justice Department. What you're doing is you're going to make it less efficient. You're going to create longer lines. You're going to have difficulties at the polls on Election Day. And this is going to make our system less efficient. As was mentioned previously, we should be encouraging individuals to participate. We should be democratizing our process, not discouraging them. And these laws will discourage. And let's, let's be realistic about what's going on. I mean, these are states, including North Carolina, with Republican-dominated legislatures, and they're responding to the fact that African Americans and others, younger members, came out in high numbers for Barack Obama and for the Democrats. And so they're responding with these laws to in fact limit and discourage those constituencies from participating in the process.
Corey, speak to the Republican argument, though, that one thing they say is, look, there's nothing sacred here about a certain time that people vote. Early voting is relatively new in the history of the Republic, as is same-day registration. Whether or not we debate the impact, the intent, they would argue, is totally different than the DOJ. The DOJ claiming here, hey, this is basically racist intent. Republicans say, no, we're making changes, and these changes are basically restoring us to the way voting used to be for a long time.
Yeah, that is the argument, but Ari, they don't have a justification for the argument. Same-day voter registration in North Carolina, it added more than nearly 100,000 people to the rolls. Now, how is it that that is a problem that needs to be legislated to fix or legislated against? So, there is no evidence here that somehow there were problems. The voting ID issue, they've always come up with the trope that we're trying to prevent voter fraud. We know that's a crock. But there were no maladies, there were no infringements on the voting process that were introduced by early voting or same-day registration and these things. So what exactly are they fixing?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's the question, and one that now they're facing some real federal pressure on. Corey Dade and Michael Higginbotham, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
My pleasure.